I'll give you a short brief about his profile. Mr. Malhotra is UN Resident Coordinator in Vietnam. Before coming to Vietnam, he served as UN Resident Coordinator in Malaysia, covering Singapore and Turkey. Born in Mumbai, India, he graduated from University Delhi with a Bachelor in Economics with honors and with a Master of Business Administration from Indian Institute of Management. Further, he holds a Master in International and Public Affairs from Columbia University, New York. Mr. Malhotra is an experienced development, globalization, and international relation expert with more than 3 decades of experience with a variety of organizations in Asia, Australia, USA, Turkey, and now in Vietnam. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Anand, the chairman of Untitled Vietnam, for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to present the UN's assessment on the economic impact of COVID-19 at the global, regional, and then Vietnam-specific level. There will be 3 main parts. One is the economic impact of COVID-19 at the global and regional levels. The other is the economic impact of COVID-19 on Vietnam. And the third is emerging opportunities to build forward better. The third part is both at the global level as well as regional and then Vietnam-specific level, which is what we are also advocating with the government of Vietnam. So I've made a few changes to what you see up there, so just please follow my presentation. And I'm happy to take as many questions after that. Just to look at the economic impact at the global level. Next slide, please.
Perfect timing.
More than 1 million lives have been lost, unfortunately, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in December 2019, and up to 90 million people are experiencing some degree of economic or social hardship this year. UNICEF reports that at the height of the nationwide and local lockdowns, around 1.5 billion school children were affected by school closures. Hospitals became overburdened, and many people with pre-existing conditions have been more rapidly succumbed to the virus. There's been a halt of economic activity, leading to massive disruptions in global supply, reductions in consumption and investment demand, falling income, huge loss of jobs, and underemployment. I want to stress underemployment because that's not often emphasized enough. I think that's been a major hidden cost of the pandemic. And a looming threat of a severe depression that we haven't seen since the Great Depression in 1929, which went on to 1933. Non-essential businesses have closed. Businesses have been forced to change their business model, cut staff, reduce wages to remain solvent. The top 5 countries with the highest deaths per 100,000 people are by order Brazil, Spain, Mexico, the United States, and the United Kingdom. This is as of recent data, according to the Johns Hopkins University, which is globally keeping the data on this. I just want to quickly, if you move to the next slide, just show you the top 10 countries by cases over the last 2 weeks before the 27th of October. India, as you know, figures very high, number 2, and Vietnam doesn't figure at all. It's not on the map at all, thankfully. But these are the top 10 countries. Of course, things are changing very rapidly this week, particularly in Europe and the United States. But this was the situation to the 27th of October. We move to the next slide. I want to focus on these 4 things because our economic impact assessment is finding that COVID-related economic vulnerabilities are particularly concentrated among countries that heavily rely on foreign trade and exports, remittances from overseas workers, international and domestic tourism, foreign direct investment, and those with weak systems of healthcare and social protection. These countries are likely to suffer larger economic contractions in 2020 and a slower recovery next year. I will come back to this because Vietnam essentially has all these vulnerabilities. So if you look at those 4 economic vulnerabilities, Vietnam is a highly foreign trade and export dependent economy, 200% of GDP or more. It is, can you go back? It's 6% of GDP is made up of remittances from overseas workers, international and domestic tourism we all know about, and foreign direct investment, which we've just been talking about in the previous presentation. Vietnam also has essentially a weak health system. And in fact, one of the reasons that Vietnam had to move very early was that its health system would have been overwhelmed if it hadn't moved very quickly and kept the numbers down. So it successfully was able to do that. In our discussions as the UN, WHO, which is one of the agencies that I'm overall responsible for, with Deputy Prime Minister Uduk Dav, we knew that if the numbers went over 1,000 in Vietnam at any given time, the health system would be under a lot of stress. I don't mean 1,000 cumulatively over 10 months, I mean 1,000, if 1,000 had happened at any given point of time. Right now we have literally just over 1,000 over 10 months, spaced over 10 months. So the health system has been able to cope. Social protection system, we have been working with Vietnam on its social protection system, but it still needs a lot of work. So this is important when we come back later talking about opportunities, and we talk about also what are the implications for Vietnam. I will come back to this, but I did want to spend a little time on this. This is, of course, not just true of Vietnam, it's true of many other countries, but since we are in Vietnam, and I've been asked to focus on Vietnam, this is important. Come to India. India's health system is pretty weak, particularly at the primary healthcare level. We can see the consequences of that. The social protection system is quite weak. When we look at the situation of migrant workers and how that unfolded in the early period, we can see that. India, of course, is not a foreign trade and export dependent economy because of its huge domestic market. It's not that dependent on remittances or on international and domestic tourism or even on FDI. But it is, those two things there are playing a major part in why India is struggling in some respects at the current time. Okay, we can move to the next one. Now, when we look at our global analysis, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, its recent Trade and Development Report 2020 identifies 4 broad categories of impact which lead to a vicious cycle reinforcing the global downturn. First, reduced consumption of non-essential services, leading to increased unemployment, loss of income, and in a significant number of cases, bankruptcy. One of the big challenges of a protracted crisis is that it becomes very difficult to distinguish between short-term cash flow problems and long-term insolvency. And I think one of the challenges we are facing globally now with a protracted crisis is it is unclear which is happening. The two merge into each other. So what began as a short-term cash flow problem is now becoming a solvency and bankruptcy problem for far too many enterprises around the world. Reduced private investment prompted primarily by anxiety and confusion. Fall in consumption and investments due to losses in financial markets. A record 83 billion was withdrawn from developing country bond and equity markets in March alone as capital sought safe havens, particularly back to their home bases. An increase in financial constraints as banks tightened their lending requirements in anticipation of higher default levels, non-performing loans, which will also be an issue that Vietnam will have to deal with as we go forward, and higher risk premiums in capital markets. Again, just to show you, I mean, one key metric that we always use, I'm an economist, and one key metric we always use in looking at how countries are faring is the Purchasing Managers Index. The PMI, as it's often known, should never be below 50 in a healthy environment. But if you look at this index, as of October 23rd, 2020, according to Bloomberg, we find that particularly in April and May, this was really down. If you take even Vietnam, you're really looking at a Purchasing Managers Index which was below 40 at that time. That was also the case in India, and it's now coming back up. But this is an important metric, I think, to use if you're trying to capture what's happening, particularly to the manufacturing sector, but overall in economic terms. Okay, we can move to, and it's only from September that it's beginning to show some improvement. But of course, that's before the current new wave in Europe and the United States, which will obviously have consequences for this. If you look at the IMF's June outlook, it predicted a global economic contraction of almost -5% in 2020 and a robust 5.4% growth in output in 2021. My own personal view as an economist is that no one can predict 2021. So while the IMF continues to show 5.4%, I don't think we can take any projections for 2021 at this stage very seriously. But for 2020, in October, just recently, the IMF had an update of its outlook, and the forecast remained largely the same. Came down, the negative came down a little bit because August, September were better, but this doesn't account for what's happening now. This doesn't account for what's going to happen in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Europe in the next 2 months. So we're going to see this figure in the negative side go up. And again, for 2021, I think it's not really worth spending too much time on at this point. But this is by region, so you can look at this by region, and you will find, of course, that this part of the world is doing somewhat better than most other parts of the world. And we'll come back to the reasons for that. You can move on, please. So just looking at that data, and that was before, and I stress, it was before the current spikes in Europe. As we know, the United Kingdom is going to go into a month-long, at least a month national lockdown. The United States is spiking as we speak, and as the election comes tomorrow. All of Europe, Italy, Spain, France, etc., are in different versions of spikes. So the economic outlook remains bleak with pockets of recovery, most notably in East Asia. Policy responses essentially range from stimulus cash transfers to help the unemployed, businesses and the poor, to macro responses such as slashed interest rates, increased funding for healthcare, regulatory easing, tax deferrals or cancellations, and bailout packages. The G20 has met a few times, and G20 members have undertaken a variety of measures concerning investments in response to the pandemic, but they're not, I've dealt a fair bit with the G20 in my time, they're not set up to deal with this type of crisis. And as you can see, they're not able to agree to the kind of unprecedented measures that this requires. They're really focused largely on accelerating the reform of investment policies, etc. So I would argue the G20 is not stepped up to the plate in the context of this particular pandemic. A debt moratorium granted by the IMF to only 25 of the world's poorest countries. And that's a big challenge as well. People are still struggling with giving more debt moratoriums because it will impact negatively on their credit rating. So the traditional kind of metrics are still holding, whereas we really need to think more creatively at this time. A landmark agreement by 172 countries under the WHO to come up with what we are referring to in the UN as the people's vaccine, a free vaccine which is accessible to the majority of billions of people who will need it. But there is no early vaccine in sight. Regardless of what Mr. Trump says or others say, there is no early vaccine in sight, certainly not in this year, and certainly not on the scale that will be required to actually have any impact. For that, we will have to wait, I would argue, in terms of scale, at least 1 year for the scale to be on. And we are really looking at shortlisted vaccine candidates. It's not at all clear that the ones that might be ready early are going to be the most effective. And so that's another big challenge. India, of course, will play a major role globally in terms of the rollout of the vaccine, given that it has the largest pharmaceutical industry in the world and also very large vaccine capability. But I think we're not anywhere near that stage right now. So overall, I think it's too soon to assess the economic effectiveness of these responses because, as I said, a vaccine has not been found. Frequent and serious spikes of infections are currently again being observed, especially in high-income countries, as I've already indicated, Europe and the United States in particular. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, which is really, it's largely focused on Southeast Asia because we're in Southeast Asia. So while, some of this can be generalized, I will basically focus on this region. The impact, obviously has been significant at the global level, but in this region, the virus has not spread as rapidly as in other parts of the world. And this is partly due to the capabilities most Southeast Asian countries have developed as a result of dealing with public health emergencies over many decades. The SARS was an example. Vietnam was also the first country in the world with our support from the WHO and the UN to deal with SARS. I think it had a handful of deaths at that time. So this is not some fluke. This is a result of learning the right lessons, of having the experience, and of having public health systems that are generally fit for purpose, although as I said in the case of Vietnam, it would work up to a certain number. but not over that number. But if you take a country like Thailand, which I've also lived in for many years, it has a very strong public health system, and you can see the result of that after some initial mistakes. They were able to bring things under control. Singapore is another example, although they totally forgot that the country is run by migrants. But otherwise, they have a good public health system. But we have countries like Myanmar, the Lao PDR, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, for example, who have weak health systems, and their vulnerability continues to be shown. Additional vulnerability is that 40% of exports from Southeast Asia rely on global value chains. So many countries are also exposed to supply chain risks, which are essentially beyond their control, as they are in the case of Vietnam. Travel bans, physical distancing are essentially all but have obliterated the previously booming tourism sector, and declining remittances from migrants have reduced what I would say more personal consumption and investment, because a lot of the remittances go to that purpose. Transport connectivity has suffered because of lockdown measures and insufficient coordination. Markets began stabilizing in April following the introduction of large-scale fiscal stimulus programs. I'm talking about Southeast Asia. And of course, China's success in controlling the virus and the reopening of transport links with China eased pressure on manufacturing supply chains by March. In the case of Vietnam, for example, by March, it was able to access what it needed from China in terms of supply chains. And its problems became more the export market rather than the supply side. So it was more the demand side, particularly in terms of global demand. And so global output continued to contract at an alarming rate as numerous countries shut down to contain the rapid spread. Okay, you can move on, please. Again, now looking again largely at Southeast Asia, but also I've shown in India since, well, this is the Indian Chamber of Commerce here. But if you look at cases per 100,000, the largest in this region is Singapore, by far. Okay, and that's because, as I said earlier, they forgot about who runs the country, which are the migrant workers. But if you look at Vietnam, it's basically 1.17. In Vietnam, we can say, and we have said as the UN and the WHO, that the numbers are real. I cannot say the same for some of the other countries here, okay, or one or two of the other countries here. But at least in Vietnam, there are no numbers that are missing. The numbers are real, and they have been real from the beginning. We have worked very closely with Vietnam on this. The numbers are real today. They were real in March. They were real in April, and they continue to be real. I want to stress that because I get that question many times. And we are absolutely clear as the United Nations and the WHO, which is part of the United Nations, that the numbers are real. But you'll hear the same thing from the CDC. You'll hear the same thing from the Oxford people here who are working on this. But so these are the numbers. But we can see that there are some patterns emerging, and I won't go into the details here, but we can just move on to the next slide. But countries that have been able to limit transmission, they're also taking economic measures which are similar on aggregate demand side, on the supply side, and you will see certain patterns emerging, but we don't have enough data yet. That's available. You can move on, please. Excuse me. Yeah, so this is where you can look at imports and exports data. And the preliminary data for 10 months of this year show significant decline in both imports and exports in the region. Despite the low cases per 100,000 people, Thailand, where you see Thailand there, has experienced a severe decline in both exports and imports, given the nature of the Thai economy. But that's striking because I've brought it out to highlight because Thailand has actually done pretty well in terms of containing COVID numbers, but it's had a huge impact on its imports and exports. Yeah, if you can move. So this is looking at the fiscal balance. If you're looking at the fiscal balance, the IMF estimates that the deterioration for Southeast Asian countries could reach 15% of GDP in terms of deterioration of the fiscal balance. Public debt levels are expected to increase, although not all Southeast Asian countries have the capacity to borrow from either the domestic or international markets. Many of the Southeast Asian countries can't. So as a result, some countries have had to consolidate their fiscal budget, reprioritize government expenditure, and improve efficiency in revenue collection and allocation. But again, I mean, these slides will be circulated to all of you, but you will see here that Vietnam, which is the second last bar, is no different. It has had a serious negative impact on its fiscal balance. Okay. Now, since the first case was reported in Vietnam, as we all know, and as I've said, the government's taken swift action. Social and economic impacts have been largely consistent with those seen globally and across the region. Although health impacts were brought under control, the economy and Vietnamese livelihoods were hard hit as a result of fiscal distancing measures introduced to spread the virus. I will highlight here again the 4 dependencies, the 4 Ds, as I call them. Those 4 Ds, in my view, have made Vietnam's economic recovery slower than it should have been, given how quickly it was able to contain the health aspects of the pandemic. If it had not had those 4 Ds, the GDP growth rate we would be seeing today in Vietnam, which is still positive and one of the few positive ones, should have been much higher. But because of those 4 Ds, and I will talk about another 4 Ds that I've been advocating to the government to sort of at least balance these 4 Ds of dependencies, external dependencies, you have that impact. Basically, because Vietnam is one of the most open economies in the world, measured in terms of the contribution of trade to domestic output and employment. Huge disruption of supply chains, especially for globally integrated manufactured goods like electronics, garments, and footwear, which you were presenting again as where you would like more investment. But I think lessons have to be learned from this pandemic for how Vietnam's economic restructuring needs to take place. And I'll come back to that. We can move on. Yeah, so GDP growth in Vietnam for the first half of 2020 was 1.8%, far below the 6.8% recorded in the first half of 2019, but still positive. And by Q3, this was estimated, Q3 GDP growth, as just announced by the government, was 2.62%, making for an overall average of cumulative of first 3 quarters of 2.18%. These will have to be adjusted later, but these are figures announced officially by the government. So I was with the Prime Minister recently, and he's very confident that Vietnam will grow by between 2 to 3%. And that seems reasonable, that it will now grow by 2 to 3%. But as few months ago, as early July, we were expecting Vietnam to grow by more. And my point about the dependencies on those 4 areas was that if Vietnam was not so dependent on those 4 areas, it should be growing by more, given how small the numbers are, even today, in terms of infected people, deaths, and how short and there was never a national lockdown in Vietnam. There was strict physical distancing in April for 2 weeks. You know, if you compare that with many other countries, that is nothing. 2 weeks here in Ho Chi Minh City, it was 3 weeks, and Hanoi. But in the majority of provinces of Vietnam, it was only 2 weeks. And yet we are looking at a dramatically reduced growth rate. A growth rate in 2020 that hasn't been experienced since Doi Moi, since the 1980s, since when I've been coming to Vietnam. Okay. So, I'm sure many of you know this, but I'll still go through it. Transportation, tourism, and hospitality have suffered the biggest blow following international travel restrictions and other physical distancing measures. And it is not clear at this stage how soon Vietnam will open up to the rest of the world. We are all basically going week by week. We are having major high-level events where we can get in a minister without all the protocols, but that's where it stops. And we have the Asean Summit coming up in 2 weeks. Normally the UN Secretary General would come, but he's not coming. Okay. Normally the ASEAN heads of state would come. This will be a virtual event. This will not be even a hybrid event. During the period of strictest nationwide physical distancing in April, millions of households, micro and small businesses, were left without income. What is important to stress here is that Vietnam's economy is largely based on the informal sector and on micro and small business. These have been disproportionately negatively impacted. So unlike an economy which would be structured differently, the Vietnamese economy has been more negatively impacted because of the structure of the Vietnamese economy, because of the very large informal sector and very large small and medium enterprises, which are, as you know, 95% of all enterprises. Now, in one thing most people don't recognize is that in most crises, the safety valve is the informal sector. When people get checked out of jobs in the formal sector, they are able to find something in the informal sector. That is not possible in this pandemic because even the informal sector has been so badly impacted. So you don't have the traditional safety valve that has existed in many other crises. Overall containment in April alone led to 15% contraction in industrial production. We are using April because that was the month with the most strict physical distancing in Vietnam. United Nations Industrial Development Organization survey conducted in July found that most firms, 92%, expected a drop in profits going forward. A third of surveyed firms expected a decline in revenue of over 50%. Approximately 41% of small firms stated that they were more likely to cut employment, and 50% reduce production. The impact on employment and incomes varied by sector, but according to the government, during the first half of 2020, more than 2 million people had lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. This is despite a very effective containment of the health dimensions of the pandemic and very low numbers. Female workers were most severely affected, as were migrants and workers in the informal sector. Exports of services for the first 9 months of 2020 have declined by 63% compared to the first 9 months of 2019. Largely due to a sharp contraction in transportation, which was reduced by 71% by June, and tourism, 56% by June, which account for 52% of service export value. Remittances from Vietnamese migrant workers estimated to account, as I said earlier, 6.4% of GDP. In Southeast Asia, other than the Philippines, which has the highest contribution of remittances, Vietnam comes second. So it is a highly remittance-dependent economy. In 2019, this is expected to reduce in 2020. So, the government responded to the economic crisis with fiscal and monetary policies. As I've said, interest rates were reduced, taxes and social security payments deferred, and direct assistance was provided to specific vulnerable groups. Okay, can you go back? I think we missed it. So when you look at this this box, this is an interesting box to look at it. If you look at all these countries, of course, red means red, what red normally means, not what it means in Vietnam. But red here means red, you're in a negative quarter, okay? Green is essentially when you're recovering. So if you look at this, you will find, as I was saying earlier about the PMI, this gives you the PMI for all these countries over the last 3 months of 2019 and the first 9 months of 2020. And you will find that, as I was saying earlier, in Vietnam, in April 2020, the PMI had gone down to 32.7. As I said earlier, 50 is just about okay. So 32.7 is a huge dip, okay? And it's only in September that it's come back above 50, okay? Trade surplus in goods and services, estimated, but again, when you look at trade surplus in Vietnam, you must understand that it's mainly because of the huge import content of exports. So with imports going down, then your trade surplus, may be a positive number, but it really doesn't mean anything. So that needs to be understood. So Vietnam will have a positive trade balance, but it will be for the wrong reasons, as is true also for many other countries. Okay, if you can move on. So Vietnam aims to accelerate the disbursement of public investments to stimulate the economy. These will cushion the blow of the pandemic, but much more will have to be done as the global crisis deepens because of those 4 dependencies. I would argue that Vietnam needs to shift the balance of those 4 Ds to another 4 Ds. And the other 4 Ds are all domestic. Domestic demand, domestic market, domestic private capital flows, and the 4th D is essentially domestic value added. Okay, so the balance, this is not an either or, but right now, from my point of view, and I've been coming to Vietnam for 31 years, since the late 1980s, and I have advised the government on economic policy over the WTO accession, etc., over many years. The balance has gone too far in terms of external dependencies, and We need to shift the balance from the 4Ds, which is dependencies, to the 4Ds, which mean domestic. Vietnam is not a small market. It's got 100 million people. It should have a middle class of at least 50 million people, not so distant in the future. It has the potential for, very underutilized potential for domestic private capital flows. Value added is very low. Most of the FDI that comes to Vietnam is what I would call enclave FDI. There is no connection with the domestic economy. So the value added of domestic firms, the domestic private sector, to any export through FDI is very low. So I think that this is an opportunity for Vietnam's policymakers to essentially rethink the economic structure. I think every country will have to rethink its economic model or its economic structure. But a quick way to summarize, certainly in my view, of what Vietnam needs to do is to shift the balance from the 4 external Ds to the 4 domestic Ds. That doesn't mean you don't export, but you need to export with much higher domestic value-added content. You need to focus much more on your domestic market and grow the domestic market. You need to unleash the domestic private sector, which is really under potential in Vietnam. And, you know, domestic demand, which is the middle class, the growing middle class. This is not a small number here. This is a large, already large and growing number. So, you know, I think that this is the kind of structural transformation that is required. You might call it the second Doi Moi, or whatever you want to call it. But I think the pandemic is showing in country after country weaknesses, not just in their health sector or in their health capability, but in fact in their economic structure. And countries need to learn the right lessons and seize the opportunities that the pandemic provides. Because out of every crisis comes an opportunity. And these are opportunities that Vietnam can seize. I've already, if we move on. Yeah, so prospects for a robust recovery in 2021 in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia as a whole are constrained both by pre-existing low rates of investment and productivity growth, rising inequality, challenges to the multilateral trading system that we have, but also, as I said, we cannot predict 2021. It is impossible right now to predict 2021. So I discount any rosy, and all of them are rosy. They're all rosy bounce back figures, 6%, 7%, you know, maybe certain economies that essentially largely rely on their domestic. And as you can see, the People's Republic of China is using the opportunity to shift domestic. And China will bounce back. Okay, China will grow because it's not that dependent on external markets. India has the potential to do that, perhaps, but other countries that are so heavily dependent on the external market will find it difficult to have a robust recovery in 2020. Now, as I said, Vietnam is forecasted to grow by 2 to 3% in 2020, which is a difference of a negative 3.5%. The projection made by the IMF just in October of last year. Okay. Now, emerging global and regional opportunities. You can also look at these as regional opportunities. There's a lot of discussion about the divergence of current global value chains from existing patterns. Development of niche markets, acceleration of public investment, which are sustainable, employment generating and provide value added. There's also a lot of talk about reshoring, which is relocating, repatriating production back to the home country. But this, I would stress, is an expensive and risky business. And it will continue to be so, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. It is not so easy to reshore. It is also not so easy to diversify global value chains. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of hype about, you know, this investment from China. It's not happening. It's not happening on any significant scale. And why would it happen if China is recovering faster and better? Private investment, unlike us, do not take into consideration human rights and other considerations. They're simply looking at a stable place to invest. And China still provides it. So, yes, there are a few that the Japanese want reshoring. There's some diversification of value chains to neighboring countries. Vietnam, of course, has been mentioned as a major beneficiary, but if you look at the hard data, it is not that much. And I think there are good reasons to explain that. It's not easy. Relocation is growing and will continue to grow, but it won't happen overnight, because supply chains are complex and hard to dismantle and replace easily. And reshoring is not. I mean, Trump's trade war with China was about reshoring. Instead, the domestic consumer in the United States has landed up paying more for what they're consuming, rather than any major manufacturing reshoring taking place in the United States. So we have to be, I think, much more cautious about that. Now, in terms of emerging global opportunities for Vietnam, trade between ASEAN and South Asia has grown strongly, I believe. Sorry, I'm on a, oh, you're still on, okay. So Vietnam is still attractive to multinational enterprises, seeking low-cost export platforms as wages rise in China and trade disputes with the US intensify, but this was happening before COVID. This is not a result of COVID. There needs to be, Vietnam needs to remain ready for those firms seeking the small, relatively small amount of supplier diversification that's happening. And of course, a lot has been made about Apple coming here. But it's just a few examples that you can look at, because there's not going to be wholesale relocation of production systems. There are quality and quantity issues. Vietnam's manufacturing output is highly dependent still on low labor costs, which will be less competitive as automation spreads and reshoring gathers momentum. Automation, there is a clear link between crisis and pandemics and viruses and the growth of automation. Automation is going to increase. It was already increasing, but it will increase further. Vietnam needs to both urgently expand, as I said, its domestic demand and improve, as well as improve the capacity of local firms to increase their value added for both the domestic and export markets. And this two-pronged approach should shift the reliance on external markets for economic growth more towards the domestic market and increase standards for potential export opportunities. A lot has been made recently of the European Free Trade Agreement. As someone who spent a lot of my career on trade issues, there are big ifs in that. One of the big ifs is standards, especially for European markets. And Vietnam really needs to increase standards, otherwise its exports will not be able to get market access into the European markets. So this is something, and of course, as I said, a lot of the FDI right now is almost on cloud. It is not connected to the domestic economy. And that has to change. This has to be an opportunity for Vietnamese firms to actually provide more value added linking to FDI, which means the quality of FDI is more important than the quantity of FDI going forward. Okay, again, looking at emerging global and regional opportunities for Vietnam, trade between ASEAN and South Asia has grown strongly in recent years, and that has potential to continue. I believe from 2011 to 2018, exports from India to Vietnam grew by 68%, and imports from Vietnam to India by 80%. It is expected that Vietnam will increasingly seek, and we are certainly pushing for this, environmentally friendly investment in the following areas. One is climate change. This is an existential issue for Vietnam and its people, especially where you're sitting, in Ho Chi Minh City and the Mekong Delta. Vietnam has the opportunity to focus much more on environmental technology and renewable energy projects. So this is a clear opportunity area for Vietnam. There is a close link between the virus and the pandemic and climate change. We keep repeating that at the United Nations. This virus and all viruses could not grow and multiply if the pressure on the environment was not so intense. So we need to deal not just with future pandemics, but with climate change. And what that will require is much more environmental technology and renewable energy projects. And whether it's Indian investors here or Vietnamese, this is an area that we think is important. Information technology, as I said, both automation and everyone's operating already half virtually. Information technology is another area. The data suggests that automation and robotics, as I said, increase after pandemics. Vietnam may seek to make use of this technology to drive higher value addition sectors. FDI, which is of a higher quality and which is employment generating. And again, I mean, I've raised this with at least a lot of Indian businessmen in Hanoi, where I live. A lot of FDI of India is very small scale. I think the data in the previous presentation showed that. It's not strategic. I've even had this discussion with the Tata guy there, Indronil, who's been here for many years. He's not with Tata anymore, but essentially it is a lot of trader kind of trader kind of initiatives rather than serious strategic FDI. And I think that really needs to change. I've raised this also with the ambassador, the previous ambassador, once. Significant potential for growth in trade and pharmaceuticals. This is, of course, an area that India can play a much more significant role. I know the challenges here on that, but I think there's a huge scope here for India to play, and especially now in the context of this virus and vaccine, and in terms of the much greater priority that should be placed on healthcare industry. So, so although the domestic pharmaceutical industry has made strong progress, it has been reported to only meet 52.5% of domestic pharmaceutical demand. And as we all know, as Indians, the cost of pharmaceuticals here, in many cases, is 10 times the cost of pharmaceuticals in India. It's huge. There are a lot of Indians who don't buy their pharmaceuticals here. They only bring them back when they come back from India, including my wife. So, now, my last slide here is really some key challenges for Vietnam which foreign investors can help with. Vietnam needs investment that will leverage new labor market entrants, including those who may have lost their jobs due to downsizing. But it has to be towards increasing the value addition of the Vietnamese contribution. Currently, the import content of Vietnam's exports is very high. As I said, when you look at the trade surplus figure, it is for the wrong reason. It is because of the import content. It's 33%. 1/3 of the value added of exports is essentially imports. This level is highest in manufacturing and construction, and this needs to significantly decrease. China's average is 10% and Thailand's is 20%, just to give you some comparison. Investments which can increase the technological and managerial domestic skill and capacity in domestic supply chains would go a long way to increasing domestic value added. This goes back to the quality of the education, particularly tertiary education, R&D, and all of those things which were being mentioned, which Vietnam is giving a lot of tax incentives although I'm not a great fan of tax incentives. I think the data globally shows that there are FDI goes to countries less for tax incentives than for other things. But that's another conversation. Okay. Okay, just to conclude, I'd just like to make a few overall points. If I haven't extended, if my time is still there, then I'll throw it up. I'd like to make just some very quick points. One is that, and that's not on my slides, but output is expected to remain below pre-pandemic trend through the medium term. We cannot expect a quick fix in 2021, 2022. And I think this is true especially in countries that are highly dependent on tourism and other services that require in-person contact. The ability to diversify goods service offering during this period, therefore, will be critical to recovery. This is not specific for Vietnam, it's specific for any country. Secondly, the pandemic's prolonged duration is creating structural challenges for policy. It is becoming increasingly difficult, as I said earlier, to distinguish between temporary liquidity shortages and solvency problems, and between temporary and permanent job losses. What some people think are temporary job losses, they will never be replaced. And I think that's important for people to keep in mind. Countries will be encouraged to prioritize measures to protect the poor, reduce informality, and reduce worker disengagement and skill erosion. This will require additional investments and private sector engagement to leverage these objectives in a sustainable, market-friendly manner. This is to do with skills development. Across emerging and developing Asia, reforms are needed to ease administrative burdens and regulatory barriers to new investment. Exports, especially of food and medical supplies, and startups. Leveling the playing field between state-owned and private enterprises is essential to support business formation and job creation. And this is, of course, true in Vietnam, but it is equally true in the People's Republic of China in India, in Indonesia. So it's true of all the major economies in this region. It is difficult to say how regulatory barriers and uneven playing field will impact quick adaptation by the private sector, though. And that's important because if we want the private sector to play a more meaningful role, then there has to be some attention paid to the regulatory barriers that currently and the bureaucratic barriers. Economic activity has also recovered more slowly in the early openers. Purchasing Managers Index that I've indicated remains significantly below pre-COVID-19 levels in many countries, including in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, for example. In contrast, indexes recovered or surpassed pre-COVID levels in countries that reopened after they had suppressed the virus, like Vietnam. The average effects of containment measures show that their impact varies significantly across countries. There's no one-size-fits-all. And this depends on local factors and characteristics. Containment measures were more effective in countries with a large share of elderly in the population and where de facto mobility was curtailed. Other factors also affected the spread of COVID-19, such as population density and the strength of a country's health system. The latter implies that containment might be more challenging in some of the more densely populated Asian emerging markets with weaker health systems. The analysis shows that on average, lockdowns led to a contraction in economic activity as measured by industrial production of about 12% a month. But an eventual full reversal of containment measures would increase economic activity by only about half of that. So 6% is lost forever. This is very important, again, for people to understand why they need to restructure their economy. This is not, it will not come back to business as usual. The analysis indicates that appropriately timing the exit from the lockdown, timing of the exit from the lockdown is the key to limiting the risk of a new wave of infections, restoring confidence, boosting economic activity, limiting the scarring effect, and laying the foundation for a stronger recovery. Analysis conducted on a sample of 39 advanced and emerging market economies based on narrative information in the IMF policy tracker and newspaper reports. Based on this, estimates suggest that the fiscal announcements of 1% of GDP increased year-on-year industrial production by only about 0.4%. So a fiscal stimulus of 1% of GDP led to an increase of industrial production of only 0.4%, equivalent to a fiscal multiplier of about 0.2 or 0.3. Multipliers were higher during the months of larger losses in economic activity with fiscal announcements of 1% of GDP, leading to about a 1.2 to 1.4% increase in industrial production. Asia has had one of the highest pre-pandemic shares of youth not in employment, education or training, particularly in developing countries. This is a major issue for countries that feel they have the demographic dividend and a large young population. The pandemic is aggravating the trend of youth unemployment. Asia's youth have experienced sharper job losses compared with other workers. And this is partly because there is a disproportionate number of youth in the services industry, which has been hit very, very badly, or in the informal sector. Youth unemployment rose 1.4 percentage points on average by June, as youth are mainly employed in high contact sectors that need personal contact, which is what I'm saying. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I may have spoken too long. I was asked to try and give a quick summary of the UN's assessment at all levels, including Vietnam specific. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Good afternoon, sir. Really very nice to, first I should say, welcome to Saigon. And it was really good to listen to you. It was a nice presentation given by you, especially the pandemic and talking about the overall Southeast Asia situation, where and how per 100,000, how many cases. And that's really
the bound is very, very going to be less. 6% is already lost. So in near future, what you said in dotted lines 21, 22, we can understand. But in reality, what do you think?
You mean the relationship between India and Vietnam?
Because you guys going to be a businesses in Vietnam.
Well, as I said, I think that the India-Vietnam business relationship is way under potential. It is not strategic in terms of what I've seen over 3 decades of coming here. And I think that even before COVID, there needed to be a significant sort of relook strategically at given the overall strategic nature of the relationship between India and Vietnam, which is very long-standing and very strategic at political and defense and other levels, the economic part of it is much weaker. I'm glad I came for the lady's presentation because she had all the data which showed that. Now, the challenge now is how can India, again, if you go by the kind of economic restructuring that I am advocating and that we are advocating to the government of Vietnam at the highest political level and the economic level about the shift in balance from the 4 dependencies to the 4 domestic areas, including value added. How can Indian investment, how can Indian trade essentially leverage that? How can India help that? Obviously, when you make an investment, you want your returns, but it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. You can help Vietnam develop capacities in certain areas. And the pharmaceutical industry, I think, stands out as one area to me. And it will also help enormously the consumer in Vietnam if prices come down. And that they're not buying patented drugs way after the patent has expired, as is often the case. So I think the pharmaceutical industry is a strategic area that India could play a much more significant role. As the data shows, the market is way under potential. Even the domestic pharmaceutical industry is not catering to more than 50% of the market. This is an obvious area in terms of generic production in particular, vaccines, etc. So what I'm saying is, I give the pharmaceutical industry as one example, but solar, okay, renewable energy. I mean, India has a huge now footprint on solar, okay. This is an area that the Indian investors should be looking. This will be a win-win situation. This country has huge solar potential. It has huge renewable energy potential, but it has problems with its grid. It has problems with many other aspects. So there is, I don't know what all the Tatas and all are doing. So it may be doing something in this area, but then obviously. Yeah, so I've asked this question many times to the Tata people. What are you doing in Vietnam? Other than coffee, I don't hear very much. So this is an example of what more Tata could be doing. What about the auto industry? What about, there's a whole range, but this cannot happen with trading. This has to happen with serious investment. And now post-COVID, I think there's a new opportunity. So I think there's a huge scope. It's way under potential.
I belong to power system. But over the years, for the last 25 years, we have seen we are in a distance. And the Indian exposed to it. But
No,
I don't have distance in the manufacturing sector, but it is only important to America. That's the distance.
Yeah, I know there are huge obstacles, which is why I also stated what Vietnam needs to do. There are huge issues on the Vietnamese side which have to be dealt with if they're going to benefit. I mean, if you look at renewable energy, there's a lot of private investment waiting to invest, but they will not invest under the current regulatory framework. Okay, so the regulatory framework, as I said, has to be looked at. The same may be true in the pharmaceutical sector. So I'm not saying that India can do it alone. I'm saying that this is an opportunity which could lead to a win-win situation for both Vietnam and for other partners like India. And there's a huge opportunity. And of course, as I said, there is a huge domestic middle class in the making here. By 2050, at the latest, there should be at least 50 million middle class consumers in Vietnam. That's huge. It's larger than almost all the other ASEAN countries. And it's a huge, viable domestic market. So you shouldn't look at just investing here for exports. You need to be looking at investing here for the domestic market. That means making a long-term commitment. Why is it that the three countries that have been, I often use this example. As I said, I'm an economist. I've focused on Southeast Asia for 3 decades as an economist. And the 3 most successful countries economically have all made long-term bets on Vietnam. Why? Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Japan. Okay, if you look at whether it's FDI, whether it's whatever, it's one of these countries, which always shows up in the top 3. Okay, I'm not counting the data from the People's Republic of China, but if you look at the data, you find it's always in whatever order. Sometimes it just switches. They're also providing development assistance. That's a separate issue, but I think India should be doing more in that area as well. Okay, because the two go together. You can't just do trade and investment. You need to have a strategic view of how you deal with a country. And I think India can do a lot better than it has to do. Given its very long-term relationship that goes back, India is one of the most. This is the first country I've been in where, in my first meeting with the Prime Minister, he greeted me both as the head of the UN and as an Indian. Right? So that says a lot in terms of the relationship. So, but I think it's way under potential.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, anything else?
Any other questions? We request you to be on the stage. I request our chairman in charge to hand over a small message. Thank you so much, Mr. Kamal.